It seems like one of the most common sense ideas in all of medicine. The shape of our bones has a huge impact on how our joints wear down. It just feels obvious. If a part in an engine isn't shaped correctly, it's going to cause problems. So why would our hips be any different?
For years and years, that simple idea has been the bedrock of how we think about hip arthritis, one of the most painful conditions out there. But what if that bedrock has a crack in it? What if the obvious answer is just plain wrong? Today, we're going to follow the clues, from simple x-rays all the way to cutting-edge genetics, to unravel a really surprising medical story. So, why was everybody, and I mean everybody, from patients to top surgeons, so convinced that a bad hip shape was the #1 cause of arthritis? Well, for a very long time, the evidence seemed totally overwhelming. And this is a huge deal because we're talking about osteoarthritis. This isn't some rare disease. It affects a staggering 250 million people around the world. It's a leading cause of pain, of disability, so you can see why finding the real cause could literally change millions of lives. The story really starts in the doctor's office. Pretty much since the day we invented x-rays, doctors have noticed the same thing, over and over. Patients who come in with painful arthritic hips often have something a little funny about the shape of their ball and socket joint. This observation was so consistent, it just became medical fact. A bad shape leads to a bad hip. End of story. Not too long ago, technology gave scientists a whole new toolbox. Instead of just kind of squinting at an x-ray, they could now use powerful computers to precisely map and categorize thousands of hips. They were on the hunt for the specific shapes that were always showing up at the scene of the crime.
And the key tool here is something called statistical shape modeling, or SSM. The easiest way to think about it is like facial recognition, but for bones. The computer scans thousands of hip images and mathematically figures out the most common ways that they vary. It basically creates a unique fingerprint for all the different hip shapes out there.
And this amazing tech quickly zeroed in on two main suspects. On the left here, you see cam morphology. That's where the ball part of the joint isn't perfectly round. It's got this extra little bump on it. And on the right, you've got pincer morphology. That's where the socket part extends a bit too far, creating this overhang. The theory was that both of these shapes cause grinding and pinching, which over time just chews up the joint and leads to arthritis.
And the evidence seemed to lock it all in. A huge study in 2017, looking at over 4,000 men, found a really strong link. Their conclusion was crystal clear. The computer models kept flagging these cam and pincer shapes as being tied to arthritis. At this point, you'd think, okay, case closed. But then, things started to get a little weird. A massive study in 2022, this time with over 40,000 people, found something that didn't quite fit. It turned out that different shapes seemed to be linked to different stages of the disease. Pincer-like shapes, the ones with more socket coverage, were linked to moderate arthritis. But the really severe, end-stage cases, those were linked to cam shapes and hips with less coverage. It was the first real crack in that simple bad shape causes bad hip story. And this brings us right to the absolute heart of the matter. It's a fundamental rule in science, and it's the question that was about to turn this entire field completely upside down. And here's the problem, summed up in 3 words. Correlation isn't causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one causes the other. You know, sales of ice cream and the number of shark attacks both go way up in the summer, but buying a cone doesn't summon a shark. There's a hidden factor, the warm weather, that's causing both. So this became the million-dollar question for hip arthritis. Does the weird shape actually cause the joint to break down, or could there be some hidden factor? Something in our genes, maybe, or our metabolism that's the real villain, causing both the unusual bone shape and the arthritis at the same time. If that were true, then surgically fixing the shape wouldn't actually stop the disease at all. We needed a way to find the true cause. And that is where genetics steps in. There's this incredible technique called Mendelian randomization. It lets scientists use the genes you're born with as a kind of perfect, natural clinical trial. See, since your genes are dealt out randomly when you're conceived, they give us an unbiased way to see if a trait, like having a cam-shaped hip, truly causes a disease, or if they just happen to show up together by coincidence. So, researchers did exactly that. In a massive 2025 study with over 43,000 people, they used the specific genes that determine a person's hip shape to ask the ultimate question: does having the genes for a bad hip shape actually cause osteoarthritis? The verdict was absolutely stunning. No causal link, nothing. The genetic analysis found that this link that we'd been so sure of for decades was, in all likelihood, just a correlation. The shape itself doesn't seem to be the root cause of the disease. This just completely flips the script on everything we thought we knew. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, but how do we know this genetic method is even reliable? Well, the researchers were one step ahead. They used the exact same genetic tools to test hip shape against another condition, hip fracture. And in this case, the story was completely different. Here, they found a clear causal link. The analysis confirmed that, yes, having the genes for certain hip shapes does, in fact, directly cause an increased risk of breaking your hip. And this is so important because it proves the method works. It can find a true cause when one is really there, which makes that negative result for osteoarthritis, well, it makes it even more powerful and believable.
So, what does this all mean for us? These findings are a really big deal, and they force us to rethink, well, pretty much everything about hip arthritis, for patients, for surgeons, and for where the research goes from here. Let's just break down the key takeaways. 1, that strong connection between hip shape and arthritis we've seen for decades, probably not a cause and effect relationship. 2, this really makes you question the whole idea of doing surgery to change a hip shape just to prevent arthritis. 3, hip shape is still super important, but for a different reason. It's a direct cause of hip fractures. And finally, and this is the really exciting part, it forces us to look somewhere else entirely for the real culprits of osteoarthritis, deep in our biology, not just in our mechanics.
And you don't have to take my word for it. The conclusion from that groundbreaking 2025 study puts it as plainly as possible. The authors say that trying to prevent arthritis by changing hip shape in older adults may prove ineffective. It's a huge signal to the entire medical community that it's time to change direction. And that leaves us with this incredible new mystery. If the obvious answer we believed for so many years was actually wrong, what have we been missing this whole time? The hunt is now on for the real, hidden drivers of osteoarthritis, and it's opening up a whole new frontier in medicine. The shape of our bones told us a story, all right, just not the one we were expecting. It pointed us away from the obvious answer and toward a much, much deeper truth.